Wild country doesn't announce danger. It erupts. Wind, fog, and food scent can turn routine work into a fight for survival in seconds. Strength meets split-second decisions, and mistakes become permanent. From a ranger patrol on an Alaskan river to midnight Arctic docks, fog-bound coves, roadside breakdowns, and crowded RV lanes, the threats vary. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters, 6 complete stories explored clearly, responsibly, and with practical safety lessons. On June 18, 2025, a stretch of coastal Alaska's river corridor sat quiet under gray skies, the kind of silence that made experienced rangers check their surroundings twice. The area had earned a reputation over the decades for unpredictable wildlife encounters, particularly during salmon runs when grizzlies converged from miles around. Local indigenous communities had long warned about the convergence zones where rivers met dense alder thickets, calling them places where the wind played tricks and animals moved like ghosts. Field Ranger Calder Boone, 51 years old and weathered by 2 decades of backcountry work, had been assigned to investigate reports of abandoned camps scattered along the waterway. His patrol partner, Evan Lockridge, 37, had joined the service only 3 years prior, but had proven himself reliable in tight situations. Their mission that morning was straightforward enough: document the camp locations, collect any hazardous materials left behind, and assess whether the area needed temporary closure. Neither man expected the morning to deviate from routine. The wind that day behaved strangely, as it often did in coastal zones where cold ocean air collided with warmer land masses. It pushed steadily upriver, a persistent current that masked sound and carried human scent downslope toward the water. Calder noted this early on, telling Evan they would need to stay vocal and alert because the bears would not smell them coming from upwind. Evan acknowledged with a nod, adjusting the deterrent spray on his belt. They moved carefully along the gravel bar, boots crunching on smooth stones worn down by centuries of glacial melt. The abandoned camps proved minimal: a torn tarp, some charred wood, a forgotten cooking pot. Calder knelt to photograph a set of tracks pressed deep into the softer gravel near the waterline. The prints were fresh, massive, with claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. He estimated the bear at over 1,000 pounds, possibly much more. As Calder rose and stepped further onto the gravel bar to get a clearer angle for documentation, the alders 20 feet to his left erupted. There was no warning grunt, no preliminary rustling. A grizzly of enormous proportions simply materialized from the dense vegetation, closing the distance in seconds. Later estimates, based on track measurements and witness accounts, placed the animal at around 1,400 pounds, a size rarely encountered even in coastal Alaska, where salmon-fed bears grew unusually large. Calder's training kicked in immediately. He tried to retreat toward Evan, hands rising in a non-threatening posture, voice low and steady, but the wet stones betrayed him. His boot slipped on algae-slicked rock, and he went down hard on his side. The bear was on him before he could regain his footing. The first bite targeted his shoulder, crushing down with enough force to fracture bone. Calder felt the teeth puncture deep, felt the shake as the bear attempted to establish dominance. The second bite came to his leg, just above the knee, tearing through fabric and flesh. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, yet some distant part of his mind remained calm, knowing that playing dead was his only option now. Evan's response was instant and decisive. He shouted, not words but a sharp, aggressive bark meant to startle. He raised his shotgun and fired a deterrent round into the gravel between himself and the bear, the impact sending up a spray of stones and a sharp crack that echoed off the water. Then he advanced, moving toward the bear rather than away from it, and threw his heavy pack directly at the animal's head. The pack struck the grizzly's shoulder, and the bear's attention shifted. It released Calder and swung toward Evan, ears flat, eyes locked. For several seconds that felt far longer. The bear seemed to calculate whether this new threat warranted further engagement. Evan stood his ground, making himself large, voice still raised. The grizzly circled once, a slow arc that brought it within 15 feet of Evan, then abruptly turned and crashed back into the alder thicket, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Evan reached Calder within seconds, hands already pulling emergency medical supplies from his remaining gear. Calder was conscious but struggling, blood soaking through his jacket and pants. Evan applied pressure to the worst wounds, wrapped what he could, and activated the emergency beacon. His voice on the radio was steady despite the adrenaline. Location, nature of injuries, urgency level critical. The extraction took 43 minutes, though it felt like hours. A helicopter crew trained for exactly these scenarios lifted Calder out while Evan provided ground support. Calder survived the airlift and subsequent surgeries, though his shoulder required multiple pins, and his leg bore permanent scars from the deep bite wounds. The fractures healed over months of rehabilitation. Later reviews of the incident cited multiple factors. The wind shear had been significant enough to completely mask the ranger's approach, giving the bear no warning. The dense vegetation provided perfect concealment for an animal of that size, creating conditions in which even experienced personnel could not maintain adequate visual range. The river noise had drowned out any sounds the bear might have made before the charge. All of these elements had converged into what investigators called a perfect storm of dangerous circumstances. Calder returned to desk work 6 months later, his field days effectively over. Evan continued patrols but requested a partner change, not out of any lack of courage, but simply because revisiting that river corridor was too heavy. The area itself remained open, though new protocols were implemented for wind conditions and mandatory 2-person visual sweeps before anyone entered the vegetation. The massive Grizzly was never identified or tracked, having simply vanished back into thousands of acres of wilderness where such animals lived and died without human knowledge. On January 9, 2026, the small Arctic harbor settlement along Greenland's northern coast lay under absolute darkness, as it had for weeks during the polar winter. The community, established in the 1940s as a fishing outpost, had grown into a modest hub of around 200 residents who depended on the sea for their livelihood. The harbor itself was a collection of weathered wooden structures, fuel depots, and equipment sheds built along a natural pier that extended into waters normally locked with pack ice for much of the year. That winter had proven unusual. Strong winds from the northwest had pushed massive sheets of pack ice closer to shore than anyone could remember in recent seasons, effectively cutting off the normal hunting routes that polar bears use to pursue seals across the frozen expanse. Wildlife officials had warned residents to secure food stores and remain vigilant, but midnight attacks were extraordinarily rare, especially in areas with steady human presence. Eric Lund, 47, had worked the settlement's fishing fleet for over 2 decades. His shift that night involved checking fuel levels in the storage shed near the eastern dock, a routine task he had performed countless times. The wind howled across the ice, carrying with it the sharp bite of Arctic air that penetrated even the heaviest winter gear. Eric had just finished his inspection when he heard the first crashes coming from the opposite end of the pier. The polar bear had entered the dock area silently, its white coat rendering it nearly invisible against snow and ice. The animal was enormous, a mature male likely weighing close to 1,500 pounds, driven to desperation by the unusual ice conditions that had restricted access to its primary prey. It moved with frightening speed despite its bulk, overturning metal fish bins that scattered frozen catch across the wooden planks. Doors to storage sheds were smashed inward, the bear's massive paws making short work of locks designed to withstand weather, not determined wildlife. 2 other workers, Soren Mathis and Ilya Novak, had been conducting inventory in a nearby warehouse when the commotion erupted. They emerged to see the bear tearing through the dock area, its behavior erratic and aggressive, suggesting extreme hunger and stress. Soren immediately shouted for Eric to retreat, but the wind carried his voice away into the darkness. Eric heard the crashes growing closer and decided to abandon the fuel shed and run for the main building 200 feet away. He had covered perhaps half that distance when the bear rounded a corner between 2 snowmobiles parked along the pier. The animal spotted him instantly and charged. Eric's boots found purchase on ice-covered planks, but the bear's speed was overwhelming. It caught him just outside another storage building, swatting him down with a single blow from its front paw. Eric hit the ground hard, and the bear was on him immediately. Its jaws closed around his left leg, teeth puncturing through insulated pants and deep into muscle. The pressure was immense, and Eric felt bone grinding under the force. He tried to kick with his free leg, tried to roll away, but the bear's weight pinned him completely. Soren and Ilya had sprinted toward the emergency station mounted on a nearby crane platform. Ilya reached it first, pulling himself up the metal ladder with adrenaline-fueled speed, while Soren followed close behind. From their elevated position, they had a clear view of Eric struggling beneath the bear. Ilya slammed his hand on the emergency panel, activating floodlights that blazed to life across the entire dock area and triggering air horns that screamed into the Arctic night. The sudden assault of light and sound hit the polar bear like a physical blow. The animal released Eric and reared back, disoriented and confused by the artificial stimulus. It swung its head from side to side, then charged toward the crane platform, where Soren and Ilya pressed themselves against the metal railing. The bear reached the base, stood on its hind legs, and pawed at the lowest rungs before the sustained noise and brightness became too much. After several tense seconds, it dropped back to all fours and retreated, moving with surprising speed back across the dock and onto the ice shelf beyond. Soren and Ilya descended immediately and reached Eric, who remained conscious, but was losing blood rapidly from the deep puncture wounds. They dragged him into the nearest heated building and applied pressure to the wounds while radioing for emergency evacuation. The settlement's small medical clinic stabilized Eric enough for a helicopter transport to the regional hospital, a flight that took nearly 2 hours through brutal weather conditions. Eric survived after multiple surgeries to repair damaged muscle and tissue in his leg. He required months of physical therapy and walked with a permanent limp afterward. Investigators who arrived days later documented the scene extensively, noting the unusual ice pressure that had driven the bear toward human settlement, the unfortunate placement of fish storage bins near accessible dock areas, and the increased nighttime activity that polar bears exhibited during the darkest winter months when hunger overrode normal caution. The settlement implemented new protocols for overnight security and relocated all food storage to reinforced buildings set back from the waterfront. The massive male polar bear was briefly tracked by an aerial survey, but eventually disappeared into the vast ice fields to the north, its fate unknown. On September 16, 2025, the remote cove on Kodiak Island's southwestern shore sat shrouded in fog so thick that visibility extended barely 10 feet in any direction. The island, the second largest in the United States and home to the famed Kodiak brown bear subspecies, had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for over 7,000 years before Russian and American settlers arrived. The particular cove where commercial diver Lucas Merritt and his crew had established a temporary camp was known locally as a treacherous anchorage, prone to sudden weather shifts and strong tidal currents that could trap vessels against rocky outcrops. Lucas Merritt, 48, had spent over 2 decades working on underwater salvage and repair operations along Alaska's coast. His current assignment involved repairing an offshore mooring buoy that had broken loose during autumn storms, threatening navigation in the shipping channel. With him were deckhands Owen Hale, 34, and Bryce Nolan, 27, both experienced in the demanding work of marine equipment maintenance. Their support boat, a 40-foot work vessel, had anchored offshore the previous evening, but had been forced to retreat to deeper waters when the fog rolled in just after midnight, leaving the 3 men camped on the beach with their equipment until visibility improved. The camp itself consisted of 2 weatherproof tents, diving gear, welding equipment, and several waterproof cases containing tools and emergency supplies. They had positioned everything above the high tide line, backed against a steep slope covered in thick salmonberry brush that grew 8 feet tall in places. The vegetation was impenetrable in most areas, a dense tangle that provided perfect concealment for the island's massive bears. Dawn arrived without bringing any improvement to the fog. The gray blanket remained settled over the cove, muffling sound and reducing the world to a claustrophobic sphere of damp air and rocky beach. Lucas decided to activate their portable signal flare, a bright red emergency beacon designed to pierce fog and guide their support vessel back to the anchorage. The device was designed for exactly these conditions. It burned with intense light and produced a loud hissing sound that could be detected from a considerable distance. Lucas carried the flare unit upslope, perhaps 50 feet above the beach, to maximize its visibility range. He set it on a flat rock, armed the ignition mechanism, and stepped back as it burst to life. The flare hissed loudly, cutting through the fog with its sharp chemical sound. and the sulfur scent spread rapidly through the damp air. For a few seconds, everything seemed to be proceeding normally. The Kodiak bear that charged from the salmonberry thicket was enormous even by the island standards, likely exceeding 1,200 pounds. It had been bedded down in the brush, possibly sleeping or simply waiting out the fog, when the sudden noise and acrid smell jolted it into action. The bear's charge was explosive, covering the distance to Lucas in mere seconds, far faster than any human could react. Lucas saw the massive brown shape materialize from the fog and tried to retreat downhill toward the beach where Owen and Bryce were breaking down the camp. His boot caught on wet moss covering the rocks, and he went down hard on his back. The bear was on him instantly, its jaws closing around his torso with crushing force. Lucas tried to protect his head and neck, arms coming up instinctively, but the bear's weight and power were overwhelming. Owen and Bryce heard Lucas's shout, truncated and desperate, and saw the vague shape struggling in the fog upslope. Both men reacted immediately. Owen grabbed another flare from their equipment case, armed it, and threw it toward the bear while Bryce shouted and advanced up the slope. The second flare ignited when it struck the rocks, adding its own hissing scream to the chaos and flooding the area with bright chemical light. The bear released Lucas and turned toward the new threat, but the combination of noise, light, and multiple humans seemed to overwhelm its aggressive state. It backed away from Lucas's motionless form, swung its head toward Owen and Bryce, then abruptly wheeled and crashed back into the salmonberry brush. The sounds of its retreat faded quickly into the muffling fog. Owen and Bryce reached Lucas within seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. The bear's initial bite had caused massive trauma to his chest and abdomen. Owen tried to apply pressure to the worst wounds while Bryce activated their emergency radio, but both men understood the reality of their situation. The fog prevented any immediate helicopter evacuation, and the nearest medical facility was hours away, even in ideal conditions. Lucas Merritt died on that foggy beach before their support vessel could navigate back through the treacherous waters to retrieve them. The boat arrived 40 minutes later, guided by the still-burning flares, and transported his body along with the two shaken survivors back to the nearest port facility. Investigators arrived within days to document the scene and conduct interviews. Their report cited multiple unusual contributing factors. The fog had created a sensory dead zone where neither the bear nor the humans could detect each other's presence until they were dangerously close. The artificial noise and sulfur scent from the signal flare had likely startled the bear from close range, triggering a defensive attack rather than the avoidance behavior normally exhibited by Kodiak bears. The dense shoreline vegetation had provided perfect concealment right up to the moment of the charge. The combination of these elements created conditions that veteran investigators called exceptionally rare and nearly impossible to predict or prevent. Owen and Bryce both left commercial diving work within the year, the psychological weight of that morning proving too heavy to continue in such isolated and dangerous environments. On April 12, 2022, the traveling circus rolled into a small town in northern Italy's Alpine foothills, arriving well after dark following a delayed journey from their previous venue. The outfit was modest by modern standards, a collection of aging trucks, animal transport cages, and equipment trailers that had crisscrossed Europe for 3 generations under the same family management. The town itself, with a population of barely 3,000, had hosted the circus annually since the 1970s, setting aside a gravel lot on the municipality's northern edge where the setup could proceed without disrupting local traffic. The region had a complicated history with brown bears. Once hunted to near extinction in the Italian Alps, the species has been successfully re-established in protected mountain areas over recent decades. The bears in the circus, however, were not wild animals, but specimens bred in captivity for static display, kept in reinforced enclosures, and wheeled out during performances to satisfy audience curiosity about creatures most locals would never encounter in nature. Lorenzo Bianchi, 44, served as the circus's head handler, responsible for the care and management of all animals traveling with the show. His assistant, Marco Venturi, 31, had worked under Lorenzo for 6 years and had proven himself capable with even the more temperamental animals. Their early morning routine on April 12th involved repositioning the animal transport cages after overnight setup, a necessary task since the truck's hydraulic lift system had malfunctioned during unloading, leaving several cages awkwardly positioned between trailers. The brown bear in question was a mature male named Brutus by the handlers, approximately 9 years old and weighing close to 600 pounds. He had been with the circus since he was a cub, raised in captivity and accustomed to human presence, transport, and the general chaos of circus life. Despite this familiarity, Brutus remained a wild animal in temperament, and Lorenzo never forgot that basic fact. The equipment corridor between trailers was narrow, perhaps 8 feet across, creating a cramped workspace made more difficult by coiled cables, metal support frames, and sawdust scattered to absorb spills and provide traction. Lorenzo and Marco had been working for roughly 20 minutes, using chains and a manual winch to shift a cage containing Brutus, when Lorenzo noticed the service gate on the cage's rear panel. The locking mechanism appeared damaged, likely from the rough handling during the hydraulic failure, and the gate had shifted several inches from its frame. Lorenzo called out a warning to Marco just as Brutus pushed against the gate from inside. The weakened lock gave way completely, and the gate swung open. The bear emerged into the equipment corridor with surprising speed, disoriented by the sudden freedom and the unfamiliar environment of the early morning setup rather than the controlled performance conditions. Lorenzo's instinct was to back away slowly while speaking in calm, measured tones, the same voice he used during feeding and routine maintenance. But the corridor's tight quarters and scattered equipment made retreat difficult. His boot caught on a thick pile of sawdust meant for the animal pens, and he went down on his side. The fall triggered an immediate response from Brutus, who perceived the sudden movement as threatening. The bear covered the distance in 2 bounds and knocked Lorenzo flat with a swipe from its front paw. Before Lorenzo could protect himself, Brutus bit down on his right arm, teeth puncturing through his jacket and into his muscle. The bear shook its head, tearing fabric and flesh, then bit again at Lorenzo's shoulder. The pain was intense and immediate, and Lorenzo shouted for help while trying to curl into a protective position. Marco had been standing near the winch when the gate failed, and his response was immediate. He scrambled onto a generator housing mounted on a low trailer, gaining just enough elevation to be above the bear's immediate reach. From there, he grabbed a fire extinguisher mounted on the generator's side panel, yanked the safety pin, and aimed the nozzle directly at Brutus. The foam burst out in a thick white stream, covering the bear's face and shoulders with cold chemical spray. The noise from the extinguisher was sharp and aggressive, and the foam's sensation clearly startled the animal. Brutus released Lorenzo and backed away, shaking his head and pawing at his muzzle to clear the irritating substance. Other circus workers, awakened by the shouting, emerged from their trailers and sleeping areas. Several grabbed whatever metal objects were nearby and began striking them together, creating a wall of noise that echoed off the trailers and vehicles. Pots, tool handles, and tent stakes all became impromptu instruments in a chaotic percussion that filled the early morning air. The combined assault of foam, noise, and multiple humans proved too much for Brutus. The bear turned away from Lorenzo and retreated toward his transport cage, which was still open. 2 handlers moved quickly to close and secure the gate once the bear was inside, this time adding secondary chains to prevent any further escapes. Lorenzo was pulled clear by Marco and 2 other workers. His arm and shoulder were bleeding heavily from multiple puncture wounds and tears. The local emergency services arrived within 15 minutes, having been called the moment the escape was noticed. Lorenzo was transported to the regional hospital, where he underwent surgery to clean and repair the damage. He survived, but required extensive physical therapy and carried permanent scarring from the attack. Italian authorities launched an immediate investigation into the incident. Their report cited multiple contributing factors, including transport stress from the long journey and delayed arrival, a hydraulic system failure that necessitated the dangerous repositioning of the cage, and a confined staging area that left handlers with limited escape routes when the situation deteriorated. The circus was fined heavily and required to implement enhanced safety protocols before being permitted to continue operations. Lorenzo returned to work 8 months later, but transferred to equipment management rather than animal handling. Marco continued as a handler, but requested assignment only to herbivores and smaller animals. Brutus remained with the circus for another year before being transferred to a wildlife sanctuary where he lived in a more natural enclosure away from the demands of travel and performance. On June 7, 2024, the wooded mountain road that wound through central Pennsylvania's Appalachian Range sat quiet in the fading light of early evening. The route, a two-lane state highway that connected scattered rural communities, had been carved through dense forest in the 1950s and saw relatively light traffic except during hunting season and autumn foliage tours. Black bears had become increasingly common in the region over recent decades, their population rebounding dramatically from historic lows thanks to successful conservation management and expanding forest cover. Siblings Aaron Whitby, 44, and Claire Whitby, 39, had been traveling cross-country in their camper van, a converted cargo vehicle they had outfitted for extended road trips. Both worked remotely in software development, and the flexibility of their careers allowed them to take long journeys through regions they would otherwise never have experienced. They had planned to reach a campground another 40 miles north before nightfall, but mechanical problems had other plans. The engine trouble began as a subtle knocking sound that Aaron initially dismissed as road noise from the rough pavement. Within minutes, however, the knocking became pronounced, and the temperature gauge climbed into dangerous territory. Aaron pulled the van onto a narrow gravel turnout, carved into the hillside, barely wide enough for the vehicle, and offering no real shoulder or safety buffer from the road. The forest pressed close on both sides, a thick wall of oak, maple, and mountain laurel that reduced visibility to 20 feet in any direction. Aaron killed the engine and performed a quick assessment. Coolant was leaking from somewhere beneath the vehicle, pooling on the gravel and spreading into a green puddle. They had barely any cell reception, so Claire called their roadside assistance, while Aaron popped the hood to investigate further. The estimated arrival time for help was 90 minutes, possibly longer, given their remote location and the approaching darkness. What neither sibling knew was that the turnout had become a regular stop for travelers who discarded food waste rather than carrying it to proper disposal sites. Fast food wrappers, drink containers, and other litter accumulated in the brush at the forest edge, and local black bears had learned to associate vehicle stops with potential food sources. The behavior was a textbook example of habituation, where wild animals lose their natural wariness of humans through repeated positive reinforcement. As dusk deepened, Aaron decided to retrieve tools and spare coolant from the van's rear storage compartment. He walked around to the back, unlocked and opened the rear hatch, and began sorting through their gear. The interior light from the open hatch cast a pale glow across the gravel, and the smell of their stored food supplies drifted out into the still evening air. The black bear emerged from the roadside brush without any warning sound. It was a large male, probably weighing close to 350 pounds, substantially larger than the region's average. The animal moved silently across the gravel, drawn by the combination of light, food scent, and learned association between stopped vehicles and easy meals. Aaron's first indication of danger was a dark shape appearing at the edge of the hatch's light pool. He turned, startled, and found himself face to face with the bear at a distance of less than 6 feet. His training, limited to what he had read online and seen in warning signs, told him to make himself large and back away slowly, but his body's instinct was flight. Aaron tried to slam the rear hatch closed, thinking perhaps he could retreat to the van's side door, but his boot caught on loose gravel, and he stumbled backward. The sudden movement triggered an immediate response from the bear. The animal lunged forward and struck Aaron with its front paws, knocking him completely off his feet. Before Aaron could scramble away, the bear's jaws closed around his midsection. The bear dragged Aaron several feet toward the tree line, its intent unclear, but its actions were aggressive and determined. Aaron struggled, tried to fight back, but the animal's strength was overwhelming. Claire, still inside the van with her phone, heard Aaron shout and looked through the rear window to see the attack unfolding. Her response was pure instinct and desperation. She lay on the vehicle's horn, the loud, blaring sound cutting through the quiet forest like an alarm. She threw open the side door and screamed at the top of her lungs, making as much noise as humanly possible. She grabbed the cooler they had been using for drinks, a heavy plastic container with metal latches, and hurled it toward the bear with all her strength. The cooler struck the ground near the bear and burst open, ice and canned drinks scattering across the gravel. The combination of noise, movement, and the sudden projectile broke the bear's focus. It released Aaron and turned toward Claire, taking several steps in her direction before apparently deciding that the situation had become too chaotic and threatening. The bear wheeled around and retreated into the forest, crashing through the undergrowth and disappearing into the gathering darkness. Claire reached Aaron within seconds. He was still conscious but bleeding from multiple wounds to his torso and legs where the bear had bitten and clawed. She tried to apply pressure with whatever fabric she could find, tearing her own shirt to create makeshift bandages while screaming into her phone for immediate emergency response. The dispatcher kept her on the line, providing instructions, but both Claire and the dispatcher understood the severity of the situation. The ambulance arrived in 37 minutes, having been dispatched from the nearest town and racing through the mountain roads with lights and sirens. The paramedics worked on Aaron immediately, but the blood loss had been catastrophic. Despite their efforts and a rapid transport to the regional trauma center, Aaron Whitby died before reaching the hospital. The investigation that followed documented the scene extensively. Investigators found substantial litter scattered throughout the turnout area and along the roadside, evidence of long-term food disposal by travelers. They interviewed residents who confirmed that black bears had been spotted regularly in the area, often near roads where vehicles stopped. The report concluded that roadside food access had created a dangerous habituation pattern, that the bear had likely associated stopped vehicles with feeding opportunities, and that the false sense of security provided by being near a car had encouraged risky behavior by travelers who might otherwise have been more cautious in bear country. New warning signs were erected along the highway, trash receptacles were installed at regular intervals, and local authorities began regular patrols to ticket litter bugs and educate travelers about wildlife safety. Claire Whitby worked with state officials to develop educational materials about bear encounters, channeling her grief into preventing similar tragedies. The specific bear responsible for Aaron's death was never identified or captured, simply one animal among hundreds ranging through the Pennsylvania mountains. On July 18, 2021, the small Riverside RV park in western Montana sat sweltering under an unusual heat wave that had gripped the region for over a week. Temperatures that normally peaked in the low 80s had climbed past 100 degrees for 3 consecutive days, driving both humans and wildlife toward any available water source. The park itself, established in the 1980s as a family-friendly camping destination, occupied a narrow strip of land between a state highway and a cold mountain river that provided relief from the oppressive heat. The river corridor had been used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European settlement, and grizzly bears had always been part of the ecosystem, moving through the area seasonally to fish for spawning trout and forage on berry patches along the banks. Modern development had compressed these ancient travel routes, forcing bears into closer proximity with human recreation areas than would have occurred in wilderness settings. Gordon Hale, 62, and his wife, Marissa Hale, 59, were traveling cross-country in their recreational vehicle as part of a retirement celebration. Both had worked in education for over 3 decades and were finally taking the extended road trip they had planned for years. Friends had recommended the RV park as a peaceful stopover with good river access and reasonable rates. They had arrived late in the afternoon, secured a spot near the center of the park, and set up their awning and outdoor chairs to enjoy the evening air once temperatures dropped. The heat wave, however, had created dangerous conditions beyond simple discomfort. Wildlife biologists would later note that the extreme temperatures had altered normal animal behavior patterns, pushing creatures that normally avoided human contact to take risks they would otherwise never consider. Water sources became critical survival needs that overrode caution, and food scarcity in the drought-stressed landscape made any potential meal worth investigating. Several campers in the RV park had made the mistake of leaving coolers and grills outside overnight, assuming the presence of other people and the proximity to the highway would discourage wildlife. Food smells accumulated across the camping area, creating an olfactory beacon that carried downwind toward the river corridor, where a large male grizzly had been resting during the hottest part of the day. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning, the temperature still hovering near 80 degrees, the grizzly moved into the RV park. The animal weighed approximately 800 pounds, substantially smaller than coastal grizzlies, but still formidable by any measure. It moved between the parked recreational vehicles with surprising stealth, testing garbage bins, investigating coolers left on picnic tables, and following scent trails that crisscrossed the grounds. Gordon had been sleeping fitfully in the heat when he remembered their water hose, still connected to the park's supply and dripping steadily onto the gravel. The waste bothered him, a lifetime of frugal habits making the drip feel like a failure of responsibility. He pulled on his shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside in his sleepwear, intending only to shut off the valve and return to bed. The narrow lane between RV parking spots was barely 15 feet across, just wide enough for vehicles to maneuver during setup and departure. Gordon's rig occupied one side, and a large motorhome belonging to another family sat directly across the lane. The Grizzly had been investigating that neighboring motorhome, standing on its hind legs to sniff at a window screen where cooking smells had accumulated. When Gordon stepped out and turned toward the water spigot, the bear dropped to all fours and charged. It used the narrow lane as a natural corridor, eliminating any chance for Gordon to dodge sideways. The attack was swift and devastating. The bear covered the distance in seconds and struck Gordon from behind, knocking him face down onto the gravel. The first bite targeted Gordon's right thigh, teeth sinking deep into muscle and grinding against bone. Gordon tried to shout, but the wind had been knocked from his lungs by the impact with the ground. The bear bit again at his shoulder, shaking him like prey before releasing and repositioning for another attack. Marissa woke to the sound of commotion and looked through the RV's window to see her husband on the ground with the massive bear standing over him. Her scream was immediate and piercing, cutting through the night air and awakening nearby campers. She threw open the RV door and continued screaming, making as much noise as possible while desperately searching for anything she could use as a weapon or distraction. Other campers emerged from their rigs, and someone had the presence of mind to start their vehicle's engine and blast the horn. Within seconds, multiple horns blared, doors slammed, and people shouted from the relative safety of their cars. The combined noise created a wall of sound that echoed off the parked RVs and flooded the area with confusion. Several campers turned on their headlights, and the parking area was suddenly illuminated by multiple beams cutting through the darkness. The bear hesitated, released Gordon, and swatted at a cooler someone had left near a picnic table, sending it flying across the gravel with a crash. The noise and light continued to build as more people joined the effort, and the bear seemed to reach a threshold where continued aggression became less appealing than retreat. The Grizzly turned away from Gordon and moved toward the river at the park's edge, its departure less of a panicked flight than a calculated withdrawal from an increasingly unfavorable situation. It disappeared into the darkness beyond the range of the headlights, and within minutes the only evidence of its presence was Gordon's crumpled form and the scattered debris from its brief rampage through the camping area. Marissa and two other campers reached Gordon immediately. He was conscious but in severe shock, bleeding heavily from deep bite wounds on his thigh and shoulder. Multiple fractures were evident, and the blood loss was alarming. Someone called emergency services while others applied pressure to the worst wounds using towels, shirts, whatever fabric was available. The ambulance arrived in 18 minutes, having been stationed in a nearby town for the busy summer camping season. Paramedics stabilized Gordon enough for transport, and he was rushed to the regional medical center, where surgeons worked for hours to repair the damage. He survived, but required multiple blood transfusions and extensive reconstructive work on both the leg and shoulder injuries. Later assessments by wildlife officials and park management cited multiple contributing factors. The heat wave had driven the bear to water and altered its normal caution around human areas. Food attractants left outside by multiple campers had created an irresistible draw. The tight spacing between parked recreational vehicles had created narrow lanes that limited visibility and escape options. The nighttime setting had reduced everyone's ability to detect threats early. All of these elements had combined to create conditions that investigators called unusually dangerous and difficult to prevent without fundamental changes to park design and camper education. The RV park implemented strict food storage requirements, installed bear-proof containers at each site, and reduced the number of camping spots to improve sightlines and escape routes. Gordon and Marissa completed their cross-country journey the following summer, though they chose campgrounds in regions with different wildlife considerations.